the first thing I want to say is that, this could be about any of your relatives tonight, because all of our ancestors had a story. They may not have known their story, and we may still be finding out their story, but Addie Browning McCartney, she would be astonished to know that almost 74 years later, exactly, because she died in early April, that we are talking about her in Jackson, Tennessee. It would be just a revelation to her to know that we're doing that. And she was just like many of your ancestors. She grew up on a farm. She had a very simple, what we think is simple, maybe it wasn't, humble life. And, but grew up in the South in the late 19th and early 20th century. So, let's see if this works. Okay, the arrow here, right? Okay, good, we're going, all right. So I'm presenting my great-grandparents, Lewis and Addie McCartney. They were my great-grandparents on my mother's side, and Addie was the link by which I was able to join the DAR. I was surprised that it was Addie. And my great-grandfather, can you all see? Lewis Wesley McCartney was born 17th of December in 1874, and by 1880 lived in the 22nd District, southeast of Bradford, and we're going to see the map in just a minute so you know where that is. And he died in January of 1950, probably from congestive heart failure. He was about 9 years older than Addie. Addie was born on the 22nd of February, 1883, also in East Gibson County in the 17th District. And she died in April 1950, about 5 weeks before I was born, and 2 weeks before her daughter, one of her daughters, Lottie, died. So let's look at the map where these people grew up. And this is a diagram of the districts in Gibson County. The three that we're talking about are colored. The top one, the blue one, is the 17th District, and that's Skullbone and North Gibson County. It sits up right next to Weakley, which is, see if I right up here, that's Weakley. And then on the side here is Carroll County, so it's real close to Tresvant, right in here. Then the red section is the 15th District. The road that runs from Skullbone through Gann into Milan, it runs through the red area, and then the 22nd District is the green one, and that runs basically 45 north is in the midst of that as you go toward Bradford. That would be the 22nd District. All of it a big farming area, and my great-grandparents wound up in the top of the 22nd District, right up here is where they wound up living for the rest of their lives. And going back, we do have pictures of the two female generations before Addie, but no pics of the two male generations because, they were older, they died earlier, right? So this, Addie's parents were William, or they called him Billy Pratt Browning. He died at age 50 in 1909 from TB, and he was the way that I was able to link back to Robert Browning, his grandfather. He was on the 1860 census at age 2. So that was a very critical piece. His parents both died when he was young. They were several small children, and so they were put under guardianship. Then Emma, my mother, Emma Beatrice Swindle. Beatrice was one of two family names that was passed down. Beatrice was passed down to my grandmother, Bertha Beatrice, but her mother's name, Drusilla, got passed down as well. So this is Emma Beatrice Swindle here with a young daughter, one of the middle daughters, Florence, in about 1892. Emma had 13 children, so we know what kept her busy, right? 13 children. And then he had died in 1909, and by that time, there was 9 that were left. And so she had lost 4 children. And as I mentioned, the name Beatrice was passed down to my grandmother. And so when Emma died in 1929, she had a child that was 21. But my great-grandmother, Addie, was 46, so there was a 25-year span of having children there. Okay, if we go one step further back to her mother, Martha Drusilla Holt, was born in 1836. Her husband was 14 years older than her, and she outlived him by 14 years. He died in 1891 at 68, and she lived to 1905 at 60, died at 69. They lived in District 22, which was the green area in the middle that I described, and I still have hopes on Martha. Martha's a possible link because there is a DAR Patriot named Michael Holt. Now, unfortunately, there's several. You know how that goes, right? And I have not been able to link her yet, as far as I know, to the Patriot. But I just got a feeling I haven't found the right thing yet. So then if we move ahead, okay, we don't know much about Addie's young life. She was born in 1883. Those of you who are active researchers, we know in 1890, there is no census record, right? So all the way, Addie's young life, there is no census record for her until 1900. But she lived on a farm, and we have a picture of this, who had to be a childhood friend. She was born the same year. Her name was Bertha Hedgecock. Wasn't she pretty? And she became Addie's sister-in-law because Bertha married her older brother, John Washington Browning. And there's a funny story about this. I go to Northside Church here in town, and about 1910 or 11, we had a gentleman and his wife come to our Sunday school class. And he was outgoing, great guy, and loved baseball, played when he was young. So we got to know each other, and you know how we genealogists are, right? One day, Bradford came up. Well, when Bradford came up, Bill got excited because his grandmother was Bertha Browning. So we were cousins, and we had never known each other. He grew up in Milan, I grew up in Bradford, and so we never knew each other. But we were so excited about finding each other, and he had so many fond memories about his grandmother, Bertha Browning. So that was such a neat find. Okay, so what was life like on the farm? Well, we know they stayed busy, right? They didn't have much time to sit around. And for females, they were responsible for many things. They had to cook 3 meals a day. Generally, if they had a bunch of children, you know, they were cooking big amounts, right? They planted and tended the garden. They preserved food. And that included, if you wanted to have fried chicken for Sunday dinner, what did you have to do? You had to kill it, you had to bleed it, you had to soak it, you had to pluck it, before you could cut it up and fry it, right? So that took a lot of work. And then hogs, I don't know if you all ever been to a hog killing. I have when I was a child. You know, growing and tending hogs was a big job. And then preserving the meat. How many of you can remember at your maybe grandparents' place that they had a smokehouse? Yeah, And so they would preserve the bacon and the hams and all of that. So that was really a very involved process. They would have cows, they would make butter, then they had to do all the washing, the repairing of clothes, learning to sew, to make those clothes and quilts, and then help care for the children. And certainly they may have helped with the crops. If they grew cotton, you know, they would have to hoe the crops in the summer, in the spring and summer, and then pick the cotton. And we're gonna look here, they probably later had to clean that cotton to try to use it in a quilt. So it was an ongoing process. And they made quilts a lot because the houses were very cold. They wouldn't have been insulated. They would just have been either lathe work or maybe big boards, and they, you know, if they used anything, they used maybe newspapers. But a lot of houses were totally uninsulated, and they would have these inefficient fireplaces or a stove that later they might have used coal with. And all of that meant that they lived in the winter. They lived in a very cold environment. And you'll see that, remember, now we've heard about weighted blankets. Well, there's a couple here, so you understand why that was the case. And then, of course, the other thing would be school would take up activities. And I know that in those districts that I pointed out, there were at least 3 or 4 rural schools in that area. And so they would go to school, you know, unless they lost a parent, like William Pratt Browning lost a parent. He might not have gotten much school because he was having to work. But in Addie's case, she probably got to go to school till she was about in the 8th grade, and that's as far as they would go. And is there anything else you can think of that I've left out here that they might have had to do?
Draw water from a well.
Haul water, that's a good point, yes, absolutely. Anything else you can think of?
Washing clothes.
Washing clothes, yes, yeah. Yeah, these folks were industrious, they worked hard. Okay, so in 1900, Addie was 17, and she probably had been out of school, maybe a couple years at that point in time, and she married Lewis McCartney on the 3rd of November, 1900. Now, Lewis is spelled L-E-W-I-S or L-O-U-I-S, so, you know, depends on who's writing it, right? But he was a farm boy in the area. He was the last son of William Andrew McCartney, who died when he was 14. So Lewis probably was working from 14. And his mother was Nancy Irvin, the second wife. This was a revelation I had years ago. I don't think my parents ever knew that they were 4th cousins, but they were 4th cousins. And the reason they were 4th cousins is because William Andrew McCartney, he was a Scottish guy, right? He had one wife who died, I think, up in Wilson County. Didn't ever get to come here, but who was a Baird. Her name was Nancy, and she died, so they had children. My dad came from that side. Then he remarried, had a wife named Nancy Irvin in Gibson County, and my mother came from that side. So it's just one big circle, Gibson County. Yeah. So by the time that in 1900, then Lewis he was 26, and so he'd been working. He might have had a nest egg, you know, something to get them started. And so we don't have much a record of their early years from 1900 other than the birth of children, but this is the only record of where they lived for the bulk of their marriage. And I took a trip taking pictures in the early 1990s, and yeah, that would have been something. So here I am taking pictures, and literally I think this is the only record, you know, of that house and barn, because I wanted to preserve it. Unfortunately, I didn't go in the house, but you know, they lived in that till they died, and then this house was, and the barn were torn down within probably 10 years of when I took this picture. So, you'll see in a minute, my Aunt Mildred told me many things. She said that on the right side, there was a front room, a living / sitting bedroom, you know, where they stayed, then a dining room, and then a kitchen, and over here were a couple of bedrooms. So when the youngest son, Milburn, married, and he and Aunt Mildred lived in one of these little bedrooms for a year. They didn't go out and buy a house, folks, and decorate whatever. Guess what? They lived with the folks till they could afford it. So that's what that was about. Then at the back, they had this big barn. It was about 150, probably 150 feet down below the house. This is what's called Sidney Baird Road, and which was a relative of theirs, and it's just north of Idlewild. It's up kind of on the ridge north of Idlewild. Now these structures have all been gone now. They were gone probably within 10 years of when I saw it. And the barn is significant because, again, from my Aunt Mildred, who told me these stories, she said around Thanksgiving, Lewis went to the barn of 1949. Lewis went to the barn. He could not get back that afternoon, and he became ill, probably was ailing already, and they nursed him at home for 6 weeks. He probably had congestive heart failure, and he died in early January of 1950. And so the barn was, you know, significant to him, I'm sure, and a sad thing how that happened. But he was 76 years old. So this is just you know, little things happen when you're doing genealogy, right? So I took these pictures and I got them all in my other pictures, right? And I don't notice for 20 years. One day I looked at that picture and I thought, can you believe that? It's got a heart on it. It's got a heart on it, right? Well, right here, I saw the outline of the heart. And I thought, oh, well, I'm just a dummy. Why did it take me so long to see that? But it meant a lot to me because it was just like a little message, right? That here was a place of love and it was significant to my family, and so I love that. Okay, now we're going to look at their family. Lewis and Addie had several children. On the left is Viola. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. Okay, wrong thing here. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they had 3 boys. So this is Viola, the oldest. She was born in 1902. My grandmother, Bert, born in 1904. Lily married a man by the name of Virgie Crocker, and for many years as I grew up through the 60s, they had a grocery store on Main Street in downtown Bradford and did very well. This is Lottie. Lottie I never knew because she is the one who died 2 weeks after her mother died in April, before I was born in May. And then Aline, she moved in 1954 to California and had 2 more children out there. So when I moved to California in 95 to 2001, I was able to go and visit her a couple of times because they only came back, you know, a few times for a reunion, whatever. So she had these 2 other children that, you know, the family really never knew much about. So anyway, then Milburn was the son that was left, and he was a farmer, lived outside of down the road from their property, but then moved in later years to Bradford. There are 2 sons that were missing. A very sad story. They had a son named Floyd. In 1931, he was 17, diagnosed with leukemia. You can imagine in 1931, not much treatment, right? So Lily and Birchie, who must have been doing pretty well because they had a car, they took him to Memphis and tried to get some treatment for him, but there wasn't anything to be done. So he died in 1931 at age 17. And then Virgil, we're gonna hear more about Virgil. Virgil was the baby, and apparently there were some behaviors that went along with Virgil about being the baby. So we're gonna learn a little bit more about Virgil, but he wasn't here. This is 1945, and let me go to the next one and I'll show you how I was able to verify that. This is them and all the children that were there, of course. I was able to verify that this is 1945 because, first of all, this gentleman right here died about 4 months later. He was the oldest daughter's husband, Hoyt Cantrell, and he died in October of that year. This is my grandfather, whom I never knew. In January 1947, he and my grandmother, here's my mother in front, she's about 15, they had built a house, and there were stumps on it. It was up on a rise, and he was pulling a stump in January, and the tractor came back and crushed him and killed him. He was about 47 or so, 46 or 7. So within 2 years, this picture had changed because 2 of the males had died. Now, of course, Lewis and Addie are in the front here. This was my Aunt Mildred, and she survived all the adults here. So when I moved back in '07, Aunt Mildred was my go-to source. And I loved her a lot, and the way you know that I loved her is because she could call me Carolyn Sue and get away with it. There's only 2 or 3 that would do that, and she was one of those. So when I called her and had questions, you know, she would tell me the answers, and I did make notes. I was smart enough by then to make notes of what she told me. So these family stories I know only because of Aunt Mildred. So I want to talk about Virgil, because you know, you learn these mysteries when you do this. You learn these mysteries that along the way, right? Here's a picture of them with Virgil. This was maybe within a year or so of the other group. Virgil was the youngest, and he was off in the service during the war, and so he was up in the Norfolk, Virginia area, and he met this woman here named Jeanette, and they got married, and he obviously had brought her home to meet the parents, right? But things did not go well. They did have a daughter, but Virgil, who Aunt Mildred said was more than a little spoiled, so I'm just trusting her judgment on it. He basically abandoned his family. They did not stay together. He left, got out of the service, and when all the time I was growing up, none of the rest of the family knew where Virgil was. It was a great hurt and a heartache to my grandmother. My grandmother would just shake her head and say, you know, I don't know where Virgil is. And he divorced, he and his wife divorced. He really never had anything to do with them. They did come, Jeanette is her name, and she did come like in the 60s and find the family and bring her daughter. So they reestablished contact. And then when my grandmother died in 1980, I was already in this search process by that point in time, and computers and databases and stuff were more prevalent. And so I found him. I found that he was alive when she died, but he died in 1983 in Flint, Michigan. So he had gone there, you know, to the car plants and settled there, and that was it. But he unfortunately totally broke his ties with the family. It was a real heartache for all the rest of the family. Okay, so things I know about Addie. which I've talked about a little bit. She had, her paternal grandparents had died young and left these little children. So because her father, William Pratt Browning, really never got to live with his parents for very long, or old enough, you know, to have discussions or get information from them, that side of the family was probably pretty closed to Addie. She would not have known much about it. And if you, in looking at the picture, you can tell she was a tall woman. She was thin and probably frail. Mildred said she got blind as she got older, and that had to be cataracts. I mean, now we think of having cataracts as a simple thing, right? You go get it fixed, 2 weeks later you get another one, right? But guess what? In the 1930s and 40s, that was not true. And so she said she didn't like to get out and go to church or anything. She just stayed around home because she was blind. So I'm sure that's, you know, what the problem was. But I'd never known that before. And a couple of things, you know, people back then stayed at home. I mean, they didn't travel around. They didn't, if they were settled in a community. She may never have left Gibson County. I don't know if she ever was in Jackson or Madison County. I don't know if she went to Trenton, you know? I mean, that was several miles away. And then, of course, she never drove, I know that, and I don't think that they owned a car. But it was a very different time, things that we can't really imagine now. And so, all right, so I want to tell you about my first surprise, kind of my first surprise. There've been surprises all along. This just takes us from Elijah, who was her grandfather, right here. And as I said, his father, or her great-grandfather, Robert Browning, was the Patriot, which I was able to prove to get into DAR. What I didn't know at the time, once I came down and looked at his wife, Frances Kimbrough, guess what? There's a whole pod of Revolutionary War Patriots right there. John Kimbrough, there's 2 here that I have waiting in Washington to be reviewed. John Kimbrough, and then his grandmother, Anne Graves. Now, for those of you who might not know, proving a woman patriot is a big deal, right, ladies? Yeah. So I'm excited about that one. Anne Graves was John Kimbrough's grandmother, and she provided supplies or money to buy supplies for the Revolutionary War effort. So those two I have sitting up there. This one, I went for 2 different names is what I was doing last time. So I may do Eleanor at some point in time. That was his mother. So that was a real find right there, to find that Addie had in her background 2 female patriots who helped the Revolutionary War effort. And then if we go down here to John Kimbrough's wife, well, there's one sitting there, right there, Captain Simon Turner. I haven't even worked on that one yet. But, you know, can you imagine that Addie would be sitting there and not have any knowledge of all of that behind her? I mean, it's just really amazing. So that was the first surprise to me. Then the next surprise was this. Any of you have an old sewing machine? Yeah, okay. Well, for years, we thought, my sister and I thought, that this was my grandmother's Singer sewing machine. Because when my grandmother died in 1980, she had a little house in Bradford, and we all went and, you know, divided up stuff and whatever, and so she had kept the sewing machine. Well, my sister kept it, she redid it and whatever, and then she passed it to me. It's been in the garage. And so I go out there a couple of years ago for something, and I pull it up, and I'm thinking, oh, this is not even a Singer. I was so disappointed. It's not even a Singer. You know, geez. I've never really looked at it closely. So I go inside and tell my husband, I said, this is not a Singer sewing machine. And it's a Wilson. It says new improved Wilson on it. So my husband says, well, did you look that up? I said, well, no, I haven't done that. Well, guess what? Wilson was an early, very early competitor to Singer, started about 1850. He was an inventor, but he wasn't a businessman. So he started trying to produce sewing machines, and it wasn't working, and he had to find somebody to help him, and that man's name was Wheeler. So they became Wilson Wheeler, or Wheeler Wilson, I forget. And they became much more successful. Well, this one just has Wilson on it, but I Googled it, and it has a time period of about 1880 to 1910. When I found that out, I realized I did not have my grandmother's sewing machine. Whose do I have? My great-grandmother's sewing machine. Because this is the time period for Addie, not for my grandmother. And I don't know that I'll ever do any, because it obviously needs, work and whatever. But, when you find a little detail like that, first of all, I learned a lot about the history of sewing machines. Not that I didn't know some, but obviously there was a lot I didn't know. And so that was just a revelation that all this time, and I started sewing. I thought I started sewing on my grandmother's treadle. I don't remember that I ever sewed on that machine, but it had to be, because that was it. But I didn't remember anything about that. And so, Addie had passed on her sewing machine. My grandmother was the only one really who took on the task of sewing. And so she had kept it all those years. So that was a big surprise to me. Then, last year, I got a message from a cousin who lives in Milan. And she was gonna have a booth. They got Rachel's attic over there and whatever. She was gonna have a booth. And she was asking me about, well, what do vintage quilts go for and whatever. And I gave her some information. I said, well, Debbie, why don't you send me a picture? She thought it was Viola's, and it was in the sense that Viola had kept it, okay? And that was her grandmother. And she sends me this picture, and my eyes got about this big. And I said, well, they were gonna put it in the booth. And I said, well, I don't need to buy a quilt, and I'm ashamed to say I didn't give them a whole lot of money for it, but they wanted it to stay in the family, so I was in agreement with that, right? So I went and met them and picked it up and whatever. And so, I got the quilt. Well, the first thing I realized was it very likely was not Viola's, because all the fabrics and the colors are wrong for that time period. This quilt also, and I have it here, we're gonna look at it. This quilt also is for a time period of about 1890 to 1910, which again puts it in the range of my great-grandmother, not with the girls who would have been sewing like in the 1920s or so. So this was, my heart stopped when I saw this quilt. Now, so I get it home, right? I start looking at it, and, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. For those of you who don't quilt, making these little triangles and get them to lay flat is not an easy task. So it's a real, it was an amazing thing. I go to my stash, these things I've brought with me that I'm going to show you, in the storm shelter in the garage, and I think, I got a feeling that there's something that matches here, okay? This quilt is one that I took out of the attic when my grandmother died. All these quilts were up in the attic, hanging over the banister. They weren't good for anything because nobody wanted them but me, right? It's not like they're in good shape. But this one I call the confetti quilt because it's made up of all these little pieces. And the fascinating thing is that This quilt has bigger pieces. Can you see that? The triangles? Well, guess what? This one has all the little pieces that are left over. And if you look at the arrows, I identified at least 2, and I think there are more. On the right, there's this fabric that's called cadet blue, which was very, very popular from about 1880 to 1910, or maybe 1890 to 1910. And then this purple plaid is in both the quilts right there. And so when I found those pieces, I knew that this quilt may not have been made by Addie, but it was made out of her scrap stash. Because I'm not sure exactly when. It was made after the star quilt because the pieces are so tiny in it. So that was a real exciting time and just a revelation to me. Now I'm going to show you my grandmother because obviously this is my grandmother Bert. Her full name was Bertha Beatrice McCartney Cates, and then after being widowed for 15 years, she remarried to Mr. Odie Bradford out west of Bradford, and they had about 10 years of happiness before he died. He was a wonderful gentleman, so sweet and so good to her. And so then she moved back to her little house in Bradford, and I'm not sure if she'd taken all those things with her to the other house and brought them back. I'm not sure the flow of that, but she was the one who, really, she's the one that's enabled me to stand here today and talk about these things. Because she talked about Mama and Papa. I heard the love in her voice, how much she missed them, and she took time to save these things. She saved, there's also an old telephone that my uncle's family has that she saved. But, except that it mattered to her, these things that they had produced. They wouldn't be here today. They're certainly not in fine shape. They're not going to be used on somebody's bed, but they're history in this family. And so I'm just so thankful, to have these things and be able to share them with you. And so I'm going to need one of you gentlemen to help me hold these up. We won't take long with them. And this quilt is an unusual quilt in that, number one, let's see, let me turn this off. Okay. It's a more planned quilt than the rest of the quilts, and it has really had a lot of disintegration of the fabrics. I think there's a good chance that this is not Addie's quilt, that it's a generation older. The browns in it and the colors in it really are more about 1860 to 1880, which would tell me that it's Martha Drusilla Holt's quilt versus Addie's quilt. And the designs and the fabrics are different. But the chemicals that they use to produce the fabrics over time disintegrated the fabrics. And so this one is unusual in that it doesn't look like it was ever used very much. And it's a thin quilt. It's not very heavy. And this chambray blue is cadet blue, or chambray blue is pretty standard in all the early quilts. So anyway, I haven't made any, we'll just lay them over there. I haven't made any effort. It's just got this on the back. Yeah, just a, like they call it brown domestic. It's just a muslin. Okay. All right, this one. They all have holes. They all have batting coming out. This one is just a strip quilt. It's a scrap quilt. They would have taken the pieces that they had and sewed them together. Then they would have used like a cardboard template to cut their pieces from, to get them all one size. And, this is something they could sit by the coal oil lamp, you know, and do, or on Sunday afternoon in the shade. And again, this is more, a little darker blue. There was an indigo blue a little earlier than 1890, but it's, you know, it's thick, it's lumpy. All of this cotton that had to be carded to put, these do not have seeds. I expected to find some with seeds in them, but I haven't found any seeds. This yellow was unusual. Again, that's that time period from 1880 to 1910 or so. And they used, you know, what they had. These blue or the black and white would have been shirting fabrics that they produced a lot of. So if you all have any questions along the way, just let me know. Okay, this one is a heavier quilt, and this nice homespun fabric is stayed in pretty good shape. You'll see on this one, this was teal, but again, it's faded badly. And this is a star quilt as well, a strippy star quilt. They are so popular, not the star part, but strippy quilts are so popular today. Guess what? I got one going right now, made out of strips. These are some blocks from my strippy quilt. And this turkey red was very common. And this one is a little different in that there was a planned pattern, this hexagonal pattern, and making it into the stars. This probably was what was called a mourning fabric, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, mourning. It was grays and soft blacks that they used. So there's that one.
The actual quilting pattern, this fan, is that common?
Yes. In the South, it was called a Baptist fan or the Methodist fan. Most often the Baptist fan. And yes, it is very common. And here's why it's common, because they would sit around the quilting frame. You know, they'd have a group at church or something, and you do this. So your elbow was your measuring. Okay. So, wait a minute. Let's see, is this one? Okay, this is fine. Okay, this is the star quilt, and my mouth just dropped when I found the star quilt. First of all, it's in very good shape. So what I think had happened, I think Addie made this quilt. I think she probably made it for a wedding gift for Viola, the oldest daughter, and Viola never used it. She put it in the cedar chest and never used it because it's in very good condition. So the fabrics in this are very, very much in the time period, the 1880 to 1910 range. By the 20s and 30s, there were a lot more brighter colors, a lot of florals, and this also, cheddar and chrome yellow, was very popular during that time period, and the turkey red. So all the plaids, you know, either could have been house dresses or could have been men's shirts. But this little fabric right here, this cadet blue, is the one that matches, and then this purple plaid. And she had to have a good amount of it to make all the, you know, the design on this one. Right?
Is that a star in the middle of this there?
It's a star, yes. This was called a Lone Star, I think, or Texas Star. So I was just like amazed to see that somebody in my family had made this quilt. You know. Okay. Yeah.
Wait a minute, before you put it up, would you pose, and let them take your picture? My camera's on the tripod.
Oh.
Want me to get out of this?
No.
You said gentlemen, so. All right.
Yeah, I get to talking and I never look good for pictures, so. Okay, so this one then, is the one that I had, already that we got out of the attic. And it's a smaller version. It's a star, only it's just made in small blocks. And I call it confetti because there is no care about what goes where, right? I mean, it's just spots of color. And here's a pretty blue, here's some yellow. But if you, we'll lay this out and you can come look at it. The pieces are tiny. just tiny. So they took whatever they had from the star quilt and used all these little tiny pieces to sew them together to cut these pieces for the stars. So I think that my grandmother could have made this quilt, but at least I know that it was scraps from Addie because of the time period. And this quilt was obviously used because it's not in as good a condition, and it was probably washed out in the old black kettle. After the winter, you know, they used coal and they used wood, so after winter, right, they would put all the bedding out in the old black kettles and boil them, and so this one has not been maintained very well. But it's, you know, amazing that we still have. Okay, then one more, and this is the one that I call, it's like a weighted blanket. I'm telling you, honey, if you could manage this, I mean, really.
For a cold winter night.
Yes, really. Okay, and it is the only one that's tied. The only one. Now, I think that this is a later quilt, actually in the 20s and 30s, possibly because of the fabrics that are in the quilt. If you'll notice, the fabrics are much brighter. They're florals, they're pretty, they're interesting. And so I think that they had, you know, they came from the later time period. This has faded, obviously, probably was a chambray, and this is like a chambray, you know, and it is like heavy as lead. I mean, you would not be moving if you were under this quilt. You would be taken well care of to stay warm. But they were quick to put together. They could be pieced quickly, and then tying is infinitely easier than quilting, you know. And they wouldn't have been able to quilt through this because it's too thick and too heavy. So, and these little ties have stayed pretty well. That's amazing. It's like a cord. It's not embroidery for us, it's like a cord. So this is the very last one. This one could have been made by the girls, not Addie, I would think. But anyway, so y'all can tell if I get to talking about quilts, I can keep on, right? But thanks for your listening, and I hope I've showed you something that was interesting.